It's the Wilk Report. I am Michael Wilk, coming to you from Cleveland. With me is Larry Bernard. How are you, Larry?
I'm doing pretty good. Had a little bit of hacking and coughing earlier, but I cleared it up enough before we started our adventure today.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going around. I just picked up some cold and flu tea myself. Uh, but yeah, I got a bit of an outrageous thing to share because Bill Maher, ever the elitist snob and hypocrite and liberal poser, uh, is once again making an ass of himself. This time he's actually attacking the late Stan Lee, who passed away uh, on Monday at the age of 95. Uh, in a in a post on his blog called "Adulting," Maher goes ahead and he's his usual elitist asshole self. I'll read off the first paragraph. The guy who created Spider-Man and the Hulk has died, and America is in mourning. Deep, deep mourning for a man who inspired millions to, I don't know, watch a movie, I guess. Someone on Reddit posted, I'm so incredibly grateful I lived in a world that included Stan Lee. Personally, I'm grateful I lived in a world that included oxygen and trees, but to each his own. Now I have nothing against comic books. I read them now and then when I was a kid, and I was all out of Hardy Boys. But the assumption that everyone had back then, both the adults and the kids, was that comics were for kids, and when you grew up, you moved on to big boy books without the pictures. But then 20 years or so ago, something happened. Adults decided they didn't have to give up kid stuff, and so they pretended comic books were actually sophisticated literature, and because America has over 4,500 colleges, which means we need more professors and we have smart people, some dumb people got to be professors by writing theses with titles like Otherness and Heterodoxy and The Silver Surfer. And now when adults are forced to do grown-up things like buy auto insurance, they call it adulting and act like it's some great giant struggle.
Hold up. Can I read a quote to respond to this? This is a perfect quote for just this moment. Critics who treat adult as a term of approval instead of as merely a descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish. These things are the marks of childhood and adolescence. In childhood and adolescence, they are in moderation healthy symptoms. Young things ought to want to grow, but to carry on into middle life or even into their early manhood, this is a concern. This concern about being an adult is a mark of a really arrested development. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret. I would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I'm 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, and Tom Baker as the fourth Doctor said there's no point in being a grown-up if you can't be childish sometimes.
Yep.
So, yeah, and here's the last part that really pissed me off. Uh, I'm not saying we've necessarily gotten stupider. The average Joe is smarter in a lot of ways than he was in, say, the 1940s when A Big Night Out was a Three Stooges short and a Carmen Miranda musical. The problem is we're using our smarts on stupid stuff. I don't think it's a huge stretch to suggest that Donald Trump could only get elected in a country that thinks comic books are important. So this is just Bill Maher showing just how unbelievably shallow and ignorant he really is. It kind of reminds me back in the 90s when he had his show Politically Incorrect, and he had a bunch of people on from WCW, including Roddy Piper,
Mm-hmm.
Sting, a couple of others, and he made this disparaging remark about people being in on the joke when it comes to wrestling, and then they all kind of took offense because they don't see wrestling as a joke. I mean, because people are actually getting hurt doing these stunts back then, and so they basically let him have it. But this guy's been showing just how much of an elite snob he really is for going on 30 years now. And when is he going to grow up and learn that just because something's in a comic book, that does not necessarily mean that it's only for dummies or that it's only for childish people? Because if you look at some of the comics that have come out in the last 20 years or so, I mean, you can't call this childish.
Well, let's kind of put a little context box around this so we can move on to better things because Bill Maher is just being a petty jerk and taking a controversial hot take so as to attract ratings and media attention to his sparse program. For those of you who don't know the backstory of Stan Lee, part of that's because Stan Lee had a tendency to misremember things on purpose and to overhype things. Stan worked as an intern at Marvel Comics. Yes, he had a relative who owned the company at the time, but he worked as an intern. Then he did some backup writing. Then Stan went off to the war. He was in the military. He wrote for movies and pamphlets and things for the military, and he came back and Stan wanted to write the great American novel, which back in the 40s and 50s was a very different thing than writing a novel today. If you were a novelist, you were someone like what's his face who wrote Ulysses, James Joyce. You were famouser than famous. You were considered a public intellectual. You'd be able to sit at fancy dinner parties with university professors. Stan was never able to make that dream a reality. And then his cousin or uncle, I forgot who it was, who owned Marvel, according to the legend that Stan Lee told us, so it may be even less simple than this, or it may even be more simpler. Stan got told, hey, DC Comics is doing this superhero trend. You worked on superhero comics when we used to do them. Why don't you take a shot at it? And so the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel Comics universe was Stan Lee's great American novel, but written out over 20-ish years, 30-ish years.
Yeah.
And when Stan no longer had a hand on the novel in the comics world, he went to make sure that this vision he definitely was a major player in birthing of, probably not as major as Stan said, got into television and movies because that's where media was going. Because Stan had a very good vision, a very clear creative sensibility, and he pushed all that stuff out. Stan invented the modern merchandising craze that we have in popular culture. While George Lucas may have been the guy who perfected it, Stan was the guy who took some of the first major stabs at it.
Yeah.
The reason we are grateful a man like Stan Lee existed is because Stan Lee was a massive creative force.
Yeah, and something that I should point out is that Stan had no problem injecting politics into his writing either, but he did it during the 1960s when it was done in such a way that it did not talk down to you, it did not treat you like an imbecile. It actually treated you like a person who could think and feel for himself or herself, and
well, Marvel was the cutting edge of the counterculture in the 60s.
Right. And,
it was right there.
Right. And in the 60s, you could talk politics and get preachy without talking down to people or assuming that they were stupid. And, and today, people insert politics into their movies and TV shows, but they talk down to you. They pander to you like they're doing something great and new and innovative. It's like, no, you're not. You're just being a jerk about it. Because one, you're insulting us. Two, you were talking down to us as though we haven't heard this stuff before and done a lot better and with more skill than you'll ever have.
And that's kind of the whole situation with Stan is Bill Maher lives on the crumbs of a creative empire built by people like Stan Lee and run by massive multi-billion-dollar global corporations that are slowly eroding and destroying that empire of creativity made by better men.
Yeah, and a large part of that it has to do with, as media becomes more and more consolidated, there's a trend towards becoming more and more homogenous and trying to make things as inoffensive as possible, but at the cost of being incredibly offensive.
Now, what's very interesting is, like, when we get to what happened with, like, She-Ra, you can see how people are trying to ape what men like Stan Lee did, but they don't understand the subtleties and nuances of it, and so they just make something utterly derivative and trashy.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because
and it's...
I subjected myself, for our viewers, to the whole run of She-Ra.
You poor man. You have my
And,
pity. I've not. I canceled my Netflix account a while ago because I
yeah,
just wasn't prepared to spend more money on it, especially after that last Godzilla anime.
and here's the interesting thing about She-Ra. Um, there were interesting ideas and elements there, but the showrunner here's the showrunner's experience. She did a webcomic. She then got hired to help co-write The Lumberjanes, which is a popular independent comic. Then she wrote for a couple of cartoon shows, and then they decided to make her a showrunner.
Okay, so basically not much under her belt before she took on a 30-year-old property that, frankly, you can't really resurrect this stuff and not know anything about it. And it's kind of
And
clear that they
there's
don't know anything about the original show. It's like, how can you not know what you're adapting?
and there's some controversy as to whether she brought certain ideas to the table or the producers who hired her brought those ideas to the table. But the different body types was a focus of somebody at a high level in production, and the focus on LGBTQ plus allegory as one of the central themes was also something that was at the beginning of the production before they even had story idea one in the tank. But
Yeah.
here's the thing that kills me is as the show went on, I'm saying, okay, I see what you were trying to do, but you did it poorly. So our audience is probably not going to be the kind of people who's going to watch this unless they want to watch this for sick pleasure. So if you're actually interested in being spoiled for She-Ra, you might want to mute for a few minutes. So there's a dynamic between She-Ra and Catra. They're the two friends that have sexual tension and competitive tension in the Horde's quasi-military organization. And the show is like this is the two lesbian unrequited loves who split apart and both joined different sides. And they're both raised by the same woman who's very abusive and who had very strong feelings towards one and had the opposite kind of strong feelings towards the other. And there was abuse angle, but they didn't use Hordak as the foster father figure. And that was like one of those little things like saying, wait, then that if you do that, then you can really contextualize everything and make the character relationships and motivations stronger. Adora is trying to please her foster father and is willing to tolerate what her foster mother is doing because this father figure is what she reveres. And then when you tear that person down, the whole catharsis of her conversion from bad guy to good guy has more meaning in the story. I also think some of that problem is that they were doing it on the Netflix 12 episode program, and I don't think that's good for these kinds of shows. I think you need more than 12 episodes.
Yeah, and especially since in the 30 plus years since the show went off the air, the style of storytelling has changed. Whereas before you could churn out like say 24, 50, 78 episodes for a show and have it broadcast pretty much like 5 days a week in syndication, and you've got commercial breaks because back then cable wasn't as big a thing as it is now. Netflix didn't exist, so you actually had time to digest this stuff and have some time in between episodes.
Yeah.
Now you can just binge watch it, and
And
so it seems kind of rushed.
so you have that element. You, of course, have the environmentalism come back in because that was a central themic beat from the old She-Ra. But the planet is techno-organic and super advanced technology that's basically magic. And She-Ra is a registered system administrator for the planet.
I see. So,
And there have been She-Ras before Adora.
oh really?
But there's been a 1,000-year breach in the chain because one of the She-Ras rejected the program.
Wow, that's completely rewriting everything. I mean,
Yes.
the original show basically was created because you had Masters of the Universe, and that was kind of tailored towards boys, and
Yeah.
the studio felt that they needed something to pander to girls too, so they created She-Ra as He-Man's
Yeah.
twin sister, kidnapped when as a baby and taken to another dimension, and kind of raised to be an asshole
Yeah.
by Hordak until events bring brother and sister together, and she kind of finally sees, she's been on the wrong side the whole time. So there's kind of like a precursor to Xena Warrior Princess, where she starts off as a baddie, realizes the error of her ways, and then spends the rest of her career trying to make up for that.
Yep. And the other element of problem with this is that they have one of the princesses, and the show's name is She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, which further deprioritizes She-Ra, but we'll get back to that in a second, is the technology princess, and she says unironically in the show that we're going to hack the planet. Yeah.
Hack
So
the planet. That's
hack the planet. So they have at least 2 episodes that are entirely focused on trying to create a STEM thing, which is a popular trend in pop culture media that's tied to girls. And again, this could have been done better with somebody who had a strong hand, who says, okay, here's some good ideas, like Stan Lee. It's like, what's that giant alien thing you're making, Galacticon? That name sounds kind of awkward. How about Galactus? And he's got all these complicated Jack Kirby drawings. What if his chief henchman is very simple, very basic? So there's this visual contrast between the 2 characters, because the visual aesthetic of your art tells your story. And since She-Ra was done by DreamWorks, we didn't want to pay to have Koreans be supervised in doing the drawings. There were lots of animation errors.
Yeah.
And the costume was actually worse than the internet was led to believe. She-Ra's boots looked like moon boots.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So that bothered me, and everybody who was having bicycle shorts on underneath their skirts, that just really, really bothered me at some visual level in my brain. I was like, that doesn't make any sense.
Oh, God. No, I'm sorry you had to do this alone, Larry.
Well, I'll call me.
Unlike Goblin Slayer, which is a
good anime.
Yeah, because episodes 6 and 7 really start stepping up the game here, because before it was pretty intense, but now it's getting even more so. Episode 6, they go to this. Essentially, it's a lake town.
It's a big city,
right?
Where one of the heroes of legend is centered, the head of the religion, the church, if you will.
Yeah, and what ends up happening is that they fight a bunch of goblins in the sewers, and come to the realization that there's more going on here than they originally thought, because there's there's references to the Demon Lord, and how he may be organizing the goblins and actually putting the goblins into the sewers underneath the city, because if they had simply been breeding naturally, it would have been noticeable, and they would not have had skills like that had been taught, like, say, able to
use a boat.
Right. And they're actually laying complex traps in episode 7.
And they're using complex traps that were designed by other people.
Right. Because, and this is kind of taking it out of a page from Tolkien, because in Tolkien, the goblins or orcs never actually innovated anything of their own.
No.
They had they made bastardized version of elven weapons, crude, kind of blunt, but not really, not really something you'd want to use in battle. Because it was just kind of like, I could take this or leave it. But the one scene in episode 7, the priestess girl talks to the one hero who fought the demon lord, years before.
The head of the religion. I forgot what title they gave her for the head of the religion, but she was the
Yeah, like
the
this, the sword
priestess.
maiden. Yeah, the
Yeah, the
sword
sword
maiden.
maiden.
Yeah. So, for some reason, she's got like this black band over her eyes. Maybe she's blind, or maybe she just
Or she's an agent of justice.
right. So, and she seems to be able to see through it because she walks around. I mean, it doesn't really hinder her movements, but uh, then the party goes back down into the sewers, and they face a trap set by the goblins, who then proceed to really go to town on them.
Yep.
And it's really intense. We get some flashbacks to the first episode where the young priestess basically pisses her pants and goes catatonic.
Yeah, and where you have Goblin Slayer even flashing back to his own past
Yeah,
when he just started off his path of hatred of all things goblin.
yeah. I mean this. I mean,
And
this is
you
what
mentioned
this is what
Tolkien.
happens when you actually raise the stakes. And
Another thing I liked is you mentioned Tolkien, how the elf and the dwarf both had a little bit of a Tolkien moment with each other as they were fighting back to back against dozens of goblins all rushing in on them.
yeah, yeah, and I really kind of like all the Tolkien-esque references here because oh my god, dude. But again, we're 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 seeing, and the nudity in this is always kind of suggested. I mean, they always cover up the bits,
Yeah.
but it's and this definitely is not something you want to watch.
This is something
want
though that you couldn't watch on a Sony anymore. You'd have to watch on a Nintendo because
yeah,
it's inappropriate levels of lewd for Sony.
yeah, because what happened is Crunchyroll had picked this up. It had been marketed as being PG-13. Well, yeah, maybe
Which
PG-13
anybody who read
for Japanese kids, but
literally everybody of us who read the manga are like, wait, what? No, seriously. Wait, what?
yeah. So yeah, and obviously the anime was going to be censored for television because there's certain things you just cannot get away with.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
they've toned this down
yeah,
from
I
the
mean,
manga. But I
yeah,
mean,
because
this
there are shows like Freezing and Dance in the Vampire Bund where they don't censor anything, and the nudity is and violence and sexual violence is it's pretty graphic, but here it's a lot less obvious, which we may be getting the censored version. I'm sure there's an uncensored version out there
well, I
somewhere.
mean, it's toned down, but I mean, we're talking about existing in a world where things like Berserk are real,
Yeah,
and this is nothing from a violence or even a sexual depravity standpoint on the level of Berserk.
yeah, because if you watch Berserk, yeah, you're probably going to come away traumatized. So, yeah, because
Yeah,
I'm a member of the
yeah.
anime club at my
Especially if you watch
college,
the
and
ending of OG Berserk, like the newer Berserk, yeah, there's a lot of heavy, brutal things in that. But the ending of the original Berserk was one of the heaviest, most brutal anime endings. The noble, heroic paladin prince sacrifices all of his friends to a demon to gain the power to achieve good in the world. And yeah, everybody gets killed, tore up, violated. And his best friend Guts barely survives the confrontation with dozens upon dozens of demons.
yeah. So, I mean, when it gets to the point where we're discussing just how graphic other shows are compared to this one, that really kind of puts it. That should put it in context because if you're worried about your kids watching it, yeah, you definitely want to say, okay, no one under 15 should be really watching this.
So I also picked up a new anime series. I watched it because I had to watch the taste of She-Ra out of my mouth. It's called Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai. This is one of those titles for an anime that really, really, really didn't translate well into English because it's just one of those long sentence, long Japanese titles. So here's the elevator pitch of the plot.
Couldn't they just call the show Phil?
No, it didn't call the show Phil.
How
So,
about
so
Bob?
Bob could sort of kind of work. So here's the pitch of the show. This show takes place in a world that's like our own, but there's all sorts of weird supernatural phenomena that are related to quantum mechanics that happen around teenagers because of puberty. That's the central conceit of the show's universe.
Okay, so that's I think I might have actually seen that it was either on Baka BT or Anime KO.
Yeah,
I think I might actually have seen the description for that actually.
So the main character is a fairly typical anime male protagonist, and he's in a library around his school, and then he sees this famous celebrity, who just also happens to be a student of his show, dressed in a bunny girl outfit. Now, let's put a little pause here for anybody who doesn't have deep anime roots. One of the first anime fan videos to come out of the Japanese anime fan scene involves a bunny girl fighting various pop culture, sci-fi, whatchamacallit things. And so this famous celebrity character had recently quit being a celebrity and was trying to withdraw from it, and everybody was forgetting her. So basically, it's kind of a Schrodinger's cat thing. And so everybody starts forgetting her at the school, even though she's this famous celebrity. And even things that are related to her, she does things, and those things stay in the universe of the story, but they just get recontextualized, even though they don't make any sense. And so it comes down to the main character and the Mad Science Girl character are the only two who remember her. And he realizes that he'll forget her if he goes to sleep, so he starts taking a massive amounts of stimulants to wake up, which is, a thing that happens, especially around big national tests, which is what happens to when all this comes to a head. And then she, the bunny girl, dopes him up so he goes to sleep because she doesn't want him to die to try to save her. And but he left notes and clues, and he left them with somebody else. And then he realizes in the middle of the test that she was real. Even though he forgot her, the memories of what she did in his life were real, so he runs out of the test screaming that he loves this girl in front of everybody in the school, thus creating enough attention and focus that everybody in the school remembers her and she pops back into reality.
Okay.
That's the first 3 episodes of the series.
You know what? I think I might have actually seen one of those episodes last week during
It's a
Anime
good show.
Club. I had come in after. Yeah, I think I had come in like after the break or something, and it already started. I couldn't actually follow it because I had missed the beginning. But yeah, that brings back. Yeah, because there's a lot of shows I've been watching. One of them is Golden Kamuy, which is another show that's been going on that I want to kind of get into. But right now, since tomorrow is Doctor Who night, I want to go back and review last week's episode, Demons of the Punjab, which actually turned out to be a lot better than I thought it would.
I have various levels of mixed feelings about it. We kind of got on the trend that was a little bit of a fake news trend because I didn't understand how TV ratings in Japan work, not Japan, in the UK work. So the ratings aren't as bad for this season as I thought they were. They are going down, but that's to be expected.
Yeah, they've kind of leveled off, but people also have to keep in mind there's a lot of people watching the TV online now. That doesn't factor into how.
Well, no, they actually have over in the UK. They have a rating for that. So when you look at that rating, the ratings aren't as bad as it used to be. The actual live audience ratings are pretty bad, but the combined ratings, it's doing okay.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like over here in the United States with the Nielsen ratings. It's like if you're just going by the Nielsen ratings, yeah, things are looking pretty bad. But if you combine the Nielsen with the people who watched it later, like they T-voted or they or they binge watched it something online or on Netflix, and it that kind of boosts the viewership upward a bit. But yeah, so we've got Demons of the Punjab, which was not written by Chris Chibnall, and it kind of shows because the villain in this one actually is a lot more present than
Uh,
he has been in all of the other episodes.
I'm not really sure I'd call that what happened in that episode a villain,
Well,
but
the villain for the episode, uh, and of course, if you haven't seen it yet, and shame on you if you haven't, uh, but they go back in time basically because this is basically the episode dedicated to developing Yaz, the Pakistani police officer from Sheffield.
what's interesting
Who's
is I actually thought Yaz was not Pakistani. I thought she was like a Sikh
yeah, it's yeah,
because they
and it's
used
like
Singh as the name, and there was like so I thought she was Sikh
yeah,
because
and yeah, because the episode kind of opens up where she's talking with her grandmother who because they travel back in time to 1947, which is when Pakistan and India were partitioned by the British government, because basically you had the Muslim population in India, which is located heavily in what's now Pakistan, and they wanted more autonomy for themselves after India had won its independence. So and there was like a lot of tension and conflict going on where uh, I guess it was just decided that they were going to go ahead and say, okay, we're just going to separate you two since you can't play nice. And that's actually not to kind of downplay the severity of what happened, because people were willing to kill over this national identity, and the episode itself is kind of like an attack on nationalism generally and its effects on human
so
behavior.
I have certain different kind of take that I came up with this show. So Chris Chibnall kind of wants to go way back to like first Doctor Who, back to basics things. But the problem is like this is stuff that the first Doctor abandoned pretty much in the second season of the show. This sort of episode of the Doctor goes back to a historical setting for a backdrop.
Yeah.
And when the first Doctor did it, it was actually informational. There wasn't really a whole lot of good information about the partition. It's like, hey, everybody, we're showing up to see people get murdered during the Indian partition. Just like we didn't really get good educational historical content about Rosa. It's like, hey, everybody, let's see if white Americans hate black people.
Yeah,
It,
and
it
it's
wasn't,
actually kind of yeah, it's kind of like a shallow version of a history lesson that back in William Hartnell's time, it had more depth to it.
yeah. And
Whereas,
that's one of the elements I have a problem with it. Second, and I understand every Doctor has to do this just because every showrunner has to say, okay, we want to have a definitive episode of the Doctor breaks the rules of time travel and goes back into a timeline and shows why you shouldn't do that.
right.
And
Although in this case, it's kind of like they're actually helping move history along,
yeah,
because
so that's they
it's
like
kind
try
of
to
like it's kind of like the what I call the Terminator paradox, where you travel back or the Oedipus paradox, where you're
yeah.
trying to prevent something from a terrible thing from happening in the future, but because you don't know all the things that led to that future, you actually end up creating the chain of events that leads to that future.
Yeah.
So
So
in this case, they travel back in time with the intention of not interfering, and end up interfering and causing the very events that led up to. So,
yeah,
but here's the thing though: the monsters,
weren't
the
monsters.
right, and yeah, they're alien assassins, very bad reputation, who it turns out their home planet was destroyed, and so they become really kind of witness. And apparently, it was destroyed by an asteroid while they were off world. So they're pretty much the last of their species. But they mourned for their planet because basically it died without anyone knowing about it. So they kind of like altered them on a fundamental level, where they decided they were going to bear witness to the deaths of people who otherwise would have died forgotten, unsung.
And my
Nobody
problem
knows
with
about it.
that is that was what we had in the Christmas special with Capaldi, a giant computer system that did that for everybody in the universe.
Yeah, and it's although in
So,
this one the names of the aliens are kind of contextual because it's actually a Indian Pakistani name that actually can have several meanings,
yeah,
such as bearing witness or an assassin or right. So it's full of double entendres and
yeah. But my
you know
problem is like it's just like a, and it was also meant to coincide with the general vibe of uh, Remembrance Day slash Armistice Day slash what we call Memorial Day here in the United States. So that was another intentional thematic tie-in there. It just really felt weird.
yeah.
It felt like they were checking boxes of things that they wanted the episode to be about, but they
Right.
didn't
For
really have a strong script.
right. And for example, the tension between the two brothers, because the one basically as his grandmother had claimed at the beginning of the episode that she was the first woman to be married in Pakistan, and so one of the reasons they go back in time is to figure out who this was because the man she marries is not Yaz's grandfather; it's someone else,
Well,
and it turns out he was her first husband who died during partition, and
I'm just confused as to
he's
how
killed
she
by
ended
his
up
own
marrying.
brother.
Yeah,
Right.
who apparently has his grandmother marries. See, that was what I thought happened in that episode.
Yeah, and the age is kind of all wrong because 1947 by now was like over 70 years ago. So this is a woman who'd have to be in her 90s, and she looks like she's in her 70s. The actress
Yeah,
who played her. So, there's kind of a cheat going on with
because the
the
actress who played her was actually her younger self.
right. So right. So, but leaving that aside, though, I thought the dynamic between the two brothers were because the guy who plays the husband Prem had fought in World War II on the side of the British to basically defend his home country, lost his older brother in the war, and that's where the demons of the Punjab come in because the aliens. He thought that they had killed his brother, but it turns out no, they were simply bearing witness to his death and recording him, for posterity, so that he would be remembered in their history. So the younger brother during that time changes. He becomes quite nationalist to the point of murdering the holy man who was supposed to officiate the wedding of Prem and Yasmin's grandmother. And then, of course, he murders his own brother by the end of the episode, which sends Yaz's grandmother fleeing and off to Sheffield, England, to start a new life there. And somewhere in between marries someone else who becomes Yaz's grandfather. So, I mean, once again, what we're seeing a lot of character development here, very touching character development, but again, the stakes don't really seem to be there. And for this episode, again, because maybe because it's taking place in the past, and events have to play out as they were supposed to in order, and so they can't really interfere so much. But it seems like that the focus is so much on character that plot is suffering. And honestly, I thought this episode was very touching, and probably the best written so far. But that's not saying much in a series that so far has been quite underwhelming. Whereas, as bad as Moffat was, he at least understood the need to present stakes. Like if this isn't done, then this is going to happen, and we don't want this to happen. So, I think Chibnall really, for Series 12, he's going to need to really work on that, and I just am not sure he's going to. I'm not sure his ego is going to let him do that. Hello? Hello, Larry. Are you still there? Still with us? All right, we seem to have lost Larry. Larry, if you're there, say something. All right, we seem to have lost Larry. So, all right, but yeah, this is pretty much about as far as we can go with this. This is Michael Wilk for the Wilk Report. If you like what you've heard and you want to hear more, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the bell icon to receive notifications whenever we upload new content. And by all means, head over to our Patreon page and help support the channel, because we do have bills to pay and we also want to improve the podcast. So head over there, plop down some money. You'll get the rewards stated in the sidebar. And that's pretty much it. So this is Michael Wilk for the Wilk Report, and also saying goodbye for Larry, who we seem to have lost a connection there. Saying take care, good night, we're out.